Good morning, everyone. My name is Moses Tebe. I'm a lecturer with IBTC. I've been with IBTC since 2014, and some of the subjects that I cover is on the objective tests. It's E3 and F3, but I think of a lot more interest to you today. I also do the management case study classes as well. And I think that'll really be the focus and why you're here today, to basically look at the case study and what IBTC basically offers and what are some of the ways that we can actually help you be a lot more successful in your attempt at the case study. But our focus for today is definitely the case study. Right, so what can I tell you about the case study? I think at a high level, for those who've not experienced it before, like I said, it basically takes the information from all three pillars. I want you to use that knowledge and basically apply it in a real life business scenario to solve business problems, right? So it tests that application in that scenario. It is computer based and it's 3 hours long. So it's always recommended that from the time that you actually start your exam preparation, work on your typing, the speed of your typing, be comfortable with using the computer and that sort of interface. It's also 3 hours long. Doesn't seem like a long time, but once you're actually forced to sit in the same place, focus and be productive for 3 full hours, it starts to feel a lot more taxing than what you'd expect. A very big part of exam prep as well is actually making sure that you're at the top of your game for a full 3 hours, because you'll find that this is an exam that exerts quite a bit of time pressure on you. So it's very good to practice that beforehand and make sure you're comfortable. So it's made up of long questions. The objective test, for those who've listened before, you'd know a multiple choice. Case study is long questions where you actually have to write out your explanations. And very important, it is marked by an examiner. That means that whoever is marking it needs to be able to read what you're saying, interpret it well, and be able to find the point you're making quite easily. Right. So you'll see that things such as how you format your answer, how you structure it, start to become a lot more important. You can't just dump information there and hope you get the most marks possible. This person is looking for specific things, and we need to make sure we communicate and present our answer in such a way that we have the best chance for success. There's a total of 150 marks, but the pass mark you'll be looking for there is 80, right? So what that means is that you'll get a mark out of 150. 80 is the minimum you must get, right? And these are your raw scaled marks. What this basically means is that because they're different variables or variants to the exam, if we are sitting the case study for August as an example, we could be writing one of 3 different papers. So once everyone has written the papers and they've started marking, that's when they'll start to identify trends. As an example, they might find that people who wrote on Monday performed generally worse than people who wrote on Thursday. And people who wrote paper 2 performed a lot better than people who performed or wrote paper 3. So basically, they'd adjust the marks to compensate for that. To say maybe Monday was just a very bad day to write, maybe those people should get adjusted a little bit higher. Maybe Thursday was very easy because the guys had 3 extra days of studying, so maybe those marks should be scaled a bit lower. So that mark out of 80 basically takes all of those factors into account and makes sure that everyone is measured on an even playing field from that extent. The different sittings that you'd have is obviously 4 times in a year, where you'd have February, May, August, and November. And then what you'd also see is that from a pre-scene perspective, 2 sittings would have the same pre-scene. So if you write in May and in August, they'd be the exact same pre-scene for those 2 exams. It's just obviously the exam questions themselves would be different. Then November and February would also be based on the same pre-scene material, right? So what this does is that in the unfortunate event that you do have to repeat the exam, it minimizes how much you need to go back and learn an entirely new business scenario for the next sitting. So for all the exams, you could write anywhere from Wednesday to Friday. Pre-scene is out 7 weeks prior to the exam. This is a very important thing, that they give you 7 weeks to basically familiarize yourself with the pre-scene. Like we said, this exam is really about testing your application in a real world scenario. So them giving you 7 weeks is really an indication of how intimately They expect you to know this fictitious organization in which you're working. Your answer needs to reflect that, and the examiner must be able to see it in how you're responding, so that all the answers you're giving are fit for purpose and they suit the context of this specific organization. Also, there'll be no calculations. So the nice thing about it is that all the calculations have basically been done for you. What becomes a lot more important is understanding the implications of them and being able to interpret them. What do we mean by that? You might have a situation whereby your company is looking to grow. So they've gone out and they've assessed different investment options. And there are three investment options, and they've all been measured against each other. Firstly, by using return on investment. Secondly, by using payback period. Thirdly, by using NPV. And each of these are positive. All of them look attractive, but each of these different criteria for each investment is strong at one or stronger than the others at one particular one. So from a numbers point of view, you could probably justify any of these projects to go ahead or any of these investments to go ahead. But understanding the context behind how NPV is calculated, how ROI is calculated, how payback period is calculated, will then tell you which one is the best one to go for. So it's not so much about the numbers and about calculating them yourself, but understanding for them to get to this number, what are the underlying assumptions, and based on what we know about the organization we're working in, which one is the best guide for us to actually take this investment and what is the reason for that. And like we basically said before, if you have been exempted from the objective test, it's important to make sure that there are no knowledge gaps. That way you'll actually be able to perform optimally in the exam, because you are being examined as if you have gone the conventional route and actually attempted and passed all the underlying objective tests that feed into that particular case study. Some of the changes or some of the key things you'll see with the case study, in the new syllabus, there have been some changes to the way that the exam is presented. And this actually has made it a lot, I would call it a lot more student friendly as well. There used to be a lot of things that added to how challenging the exam was. A few of them have actually been made a lot easier. Among them, for one, it's no longer ICS. ICS is integrated case study. So basically saying there are no integration marks. It was not just about how well you know the three pillars in isolation, but how well you integrate them as well. So they wanted you to understand the fact that a topic in your E pillar impacts something in the F and P pillar and all of those relations. Now you might start to see a bit more of a logical separation between all three. But it's still very important to understand the three pillars and the relations between them. Time allocations are now being given. So previously, they wouldn't tell you how much of your time you should be spending on each part of the question. You'll see in the example at the bottom and the little red circles where you see that there are two question requirements, and they tell you that subtask A and B should take 50% each. So you'll always see that for each task, there's a time allocation for the task overall, and now they tell you how much time you should be spending on each subtask. So before, this is something that you'd have to pretty much determine on your own, and now they've actually done well to actually give you that sort of guidance. This is very important because in the exam, you aren't being given a mark allocation. So to understand how much writing and how much information you need to devote to each and every subtask, time is the best indication of that. So understanding that being given to you is very, very important. Over and above that is how it's basically structured from an assessment perspective. You'll see we speak quite a bit about I can statements. This basically says for each topic, under each of the chapters in our study text and our study material, there are certain I can statements that we must be able to answer in the positive. So an example of that, if we're looking at evaluating business ecosystems and business environments, I can select and apply suitable strategic analytical tools. The answer for that should be yes. Then you know that I'm comfortable with that bit. And the key is to go through all of these I can statements, and this will tell you how each of those things or each of those areas will basically be assessed. This is one way to make sure that you're actually comfortable with an entire body of work before moving on. All right. So always look at those I can statements. They're a very, very good guide for the case study itself, and they're a way to basically check whether we are where we should be. So we discussed the pre-scene briefly, but this basically tells us what to expect in our case study exam. The pre-scene makes up a very, very important part of it because this is the basis upon which the entire exam is basically set. This is the background we're using, and this is the organization that we are working in on a day-to-day basis. So what we'll basically get 7 weeks before our exam is something similar to this, where you'll get the organization, they'll tell you all about the background, the industry it operates in, how they go about actually operating. This is their business model, where they add value. They'll tell you about the staff, the board structure, the risks. They'll basically immerse you into what this specific company basically does and what makes it tick. And it's important that you get very, very familiar with this information in order to be successful at the organization. Very important as well is in the first line of it, you'll always see that they tell you exactly what position you occupy. With this Royal Gyms example, you'll see there on the left, underneath this image over here, they tell you you are the senior manager who works in the finance team. What this starts to do is that it already sets the tone and helps you understand that all your responses and how you approach this should have the level of comfort of someone who works in this organization on a day-to-day basis. Your answer should not come across as if you're a consultant that's specifically looking at it for a short period of time. You must have that appreciation of the organization as if it's your bread and butter and you know it inside and out. And that's really the importance of the pre-scene and why we cannot, we could never sort of take it for granted just how much value it adds. What you'll see as well is that a very, very big part of the classroom delivery for case study classes informs pre-scene analysis. And you'll see as you go through a lot of senior material, they definitely can't stress this enough. Having a thorough pre-scene analysis to make sure we understand it is a key part to determine success in the exam. So you'll be given a lot of information. You'll have information about the financial side, the actual operations, about the people, also about the industry and what are some of the issues that the organization is facing. These are all the things that create the kind of context you'll need, and they also start to give you a good idea of what direction a lot of the questions might come from in the exam. There's a lot of core topics at each of the different levels for CIMA, and it becomes important to understand how each of those basically tie in. You also get your financials, you get your organogram, just to understand who the different role players are. With the financials, I think at each level, the importance of financial ratios is quite well known. You have the financials, it's important to understand the ratios beforehand. This is not something you should be doing in the exam. It's basically use all the information you have here to get as much understanding and create as much meaning as possible of this environment that you're basically looking at, right? So when you actually look at what we get or how we basically approach it from a IBTC perspective, you will get as part of your study material what we call a pre-scene analysis. So this is a good way to look at how BPP or some of the key things that they've basically identified is to say they analyze the pre-scene and look at some of the things that basically stand out. What will form part of this pre-scene analysis? One is a perspective from each of the 3 pillars. So there'll be an E pillar where they basically say, out of the information we've been given, these are some of the things that's basically pop out. And from the topics that form part of this chapter, these are the ones that we see as emerging as quite important. It's not limited to just those, but those are the ones where they can basically see a strong tie based on the information you've been given. They'll do that for E, for F, and for P. From an F perspective, that's where you also probably get a ratio analysis being done, but it actually allows you to add a bit of structure to all the information you've been given. And what this can do is that, especially once you've taken time to familiarize yourself with the pre-scene, this starts to form a basis of your sort of revision notes or a summary of everything that's there. right? But this is very, very valuable after you've taken the time to get to know the pre-scene very well. If you just use this as a summary and read that, there's a lot of finer detail and nuances that you might not get and you might not appreciate. But after you've taken the time to understand the pre-scene, then this pre-scene analysis is very, very valuable as part of your preparations as well. Then also included as part of the study material through IBTC is that you will also get mock exams for that specific sitting. So this is a very, very important thing to say that in your preparations, you're going to go through all the work in the study text. We're going to do or work through the workbook, which gives you some case study style questions based on different scenarios. But these mock exams are based on the exact same pre-scene that you'll basically be writing on in the exam. The power and value of that is basically to say that by the time you're writing the exam, you would have already practiced a similar sort of scenario 2 or 3 times and have written 2 or 3 exams that are on the exact same work before. So it's very important that these mock exams are done in an exam type of environment, and you are as strict on yourself as you would be in an actual exam, because these are very, very good tests to see how ready you are. And from a difficulty point of view, they're actually quite on par with what you can expect in the exam itself. So it's almost a case of saying, I'm practicing the exact same way I'll be in the exam. It forces you to actually see how well you're applying the pre-scene material to the actual response. And the nice thing about it is that it also comes with a marking structure. So you can actually mark yourself and see how you would have scored in the exam itself, right? So this is basically how the information is presented, where you will get a task. It will be an email from somebody telling you what's going on. Then at the end, they'll basically give you a certain requirement, right? So here, if you look at what they've asked us, you see that at the end or in the last paragraph, they say, if we proceed to purchase each of these targets, we'll need to think about how we finance a deal. Can you outline our options here, including the pros and cons of each method of finance? Right, very, very open sort of question around it, but you know that they're basically now saying, well, what options do we have for financing it? You basically have debt and equity. There are different instruments under that, but then you basically have to give the pros and cons of each method of finance. Very important, right? To see that we've answered every part of the question. Firstly, outline the options, debt, equity, also include the pros and cons of each method of finance. You with me? And that's really where the meat of it will be, to actually make sure you understand each of them well. And if you're asked to recommend a certain form of finance, you need to understand in this context which one is fit for purpose. And that's why we say you take the information from your 3 pillars and then you basically apply it to the context you've been given, right? Every now and then there's also additional analysis. This is what we call our unseen material. Like, you've got 7 weeks to familiarize yourself with a lot of the pre-scene aspects of the case study. Then on the exam day itself, they'll introduce new information which is relevant to what is being asked. All right. This new information is not very far-fetched. It ties in with what's in the pre-scene, but this is what adds that nuance as to how you must answer the question. You'll see as you work through the pre-scene, there's a lot of things that you'll look at, and if you try fit it into the work and say, well, what's the right way to approach this, you'll still be left with a few gray areas where you think, you know what, it depends. If such and such is the case, this is suitable. If such and such is the case, the alternative is suitable. What the unseen material then aims to do is basically remove that gray area. It starts to push you in a very definite direction so that you've got the right kind of context and understand what sort of approach you should follow for your answer. So that's why it's very, very important. And as you provide a response, you need to always make sure that you constantly refer to the pre-scene and, very importantly, the unseen material, because that's what shows that the answer you're giving is relevant and actually addresses the problem that you've been presented with. Right, task number 2 is a good example. Like we said, this is a 3-hour exam, but one of the very, very key things about it is that the 3 hours and the tasks have to be done sequentially. What does this mean? In a normal exam, if you know that there are 4 tasks for you to do, you could start reading task number 1 and just think to yourself, nope, this is far too difficult. Let me do an easier question first. Then you go to task number 3. It's something that you're much better prepared for. and you do that first, builds up your confidence. That way you actually perform better even on the difficult questions. In the case study, you don't have that luxury. And that's one of the things that makes it so difficult. To say you have to do task number one first, and the time that's been given for task number one is limited to task number one. What does that mean? If you had 60 minutes for task number one, if you finish in 40 minutes and you click next, then that's done. You don't have 20 minutes to carry over to the other questions. You've basically forfeited that 20 minutes. And also, once you click next, you can't come back to task number one and look at it again, right? A good way to see that is that as you see task number two here, as it starts, they tell you a week has passed since your email conversation with Carl. So the next task is basically at a future point in time. You can't go back and fix what you did before. So that's why it's very, very important that we understand the work well enough that no matter what questions in front of us, we can actually perform optimally at it, right? And we can bring out the best answer as and when necessary from us. Also important is the time management aspect. And like I said, because they give time allocations, we have to be strict on ourselves about that. And if we have 60 minutes and there are two subtasks, 50% each, if 30 minutes has elapsed, make sure you start the second part, because you'll find that you will get more value from making or answering the question more thoroughly, as opposed to having an extremely detailed answer in one and a very thin answer in the other part. There's only so many marks you'll get for each part of the question. It's rather important that we use our time optimally and answer the question holistically and thoroughly, as opposed to having part of it answered really well and another part not answered well at all. Right. So you'll see, like we said, it's very important that as we look at the questions, always stick to what has been asked of you. They're very, very specific as to the question requirements. And if you have time, I always recommend you look at some of the past exam settings and especially read the examiner's comments. You'd be shocked how many times or how often students lose marks because they did not answer the question requirements. It's very, very easy to skim over what the question requirement is and read some keywords and think, oh, they want me to look at this piece of work and explain it. But that might not necessarily be what they've asked you, right? What they want is what you must answer, and your answer must address that. If not, it will not score well. You with me? So always be sure that we're answering what is asked. Use the requirements and what has been asked of you to structure your answer. This will also make sure that you don't miss out on anything, and it's also quite easy to follow and give marks accordingly. Then, like I said, with mock exams and actually all the questions in the workbook as well, one of the benefits you have is that there's a mark allocation and you can use the marking scheme to assess yourself. I always recommend be very, very strict with yourself when you do this. Rather err on the side of being strict. What that does is make sure that you raise your standard of answering and actually get better as you do it, as opposed to being too lenient on yourself. Then in the actual exam, you find that the examiner uses a much higher sort of benchmark for marking. So it's quite important to make sure that we're strict on ourselves. That way, by the time we get to the exam, we're already performing at a standard that's high enough to make sure that we always score well in whatever responses we give. All right. So when we look at how do we prepare for our case study, there's a few key approaches there. And I think I've touched on it around the different study methods and the delivery of the material. But we always have our classroom. Our classroom is always the most recommended. And it's like I said, it's a very, very good platform for you to basically share your ideas, get and actually debate the merits of what we see in the pre-scene, and actually go through a process of joint learning. There are certain perspectives that people with different backgrounds and different experience will have that you might not have at the top of your mind. But being in that space actually exposes you to that. And these are things that you can bring in the exam itself. So it's not just your viewpoint that you're putting forward, it's actually your viewpoint and different productive ideas that came out in class as well. So that actual engagement has shown a lot of value, because like we say, this is a real life business sort of scenario they expect you to answer to. So different kinds of real life business experience actually adds value to it. How we deliver the classes is basically over 2 weekends. So that'll be a Saturday and a Sunday. Then we normally have a break in between, then another Saturday and Sunday. I know it seems like 4 classes is very, very little, but like we said, we've developed a program whereby 4 classes is enough. And after those 4 classes, you'll be in a good place to actually perform well on the exam. Be under no illusion, in those 4 classes in those 2 weeks, there is a lot of work that takes place. But more than anything, your efforts are then focused. You make sure that you're focusing on the right things. It's easier to identify any knowledge gaps you might have and understand what areas you need to address. And also, everything that we do is tailored and basically takes gradual steps towards getting you exam ready and making sure that we take all the knowledge we have and we are good at basically applying it to the exam. Over and above this, you'll also get the enhanced classroom. This is basically our online platform where there are also recorded lectures and also material to fill in any sort of knowledge gaps which you might have, which is a very, very good value add. So if you've got the enhanced classroom and use that over and above the actual face-to-face classes, you're in a very, very good place with regards to your preparation, right? We also understand that there are students who don't have the time or the capacity to actually attend the face-to-face classes. And for those, that's where we basically have our online resources that exist by themselves. The nice thing about that, though, is to say with your online resources that you use for basically home study, you do still have access to IPTC Tutor, so you could be able to ask any questions if you come across any difficulty, email them through to a tutor, and they'll basically respond to you. And the tutors, for the most part, are the people who basically deliver that content on a face-to-face basis. So you would still have that benefit, but specifically for case study, there's a world of difference and clear benefits to actually attending face-to-face classes. So if possible, please do that for yourself. If not, then your online classes can make quite a big difference in your preparation as well. So for each of the courses, you basically get 3 different kinds of books. So here you see spoken about the study texts. These basically give you the information or the ones that you use to understand each of the 3 different pillars on E, P, and F, right? And these are the ones that you'd also use for your objective tests. Should you have any sort of knowledge gaps on any of the pillars, then it would be recommended that, just get familiar with the work that's in the study text for that specific one. If it's something you're really well versed and comfortable with as part of your exemptions, then you'll find there's a lot less reliance on that. Over and above that, you'll also have the workbook. The nice thing about the workbook, especially for case study, is that it starts to give you exam type questions or case study style questions. Each of them is a bit of an explanation, gives you some background, then they ask you about it. The other nice thing about it is that if you know that you're very strong at E and P, you're not so strong at F, in the workbook there's a section with questions just on F. So you'll know if you're testing your knowledge overall or if you're trying to address specific problem areas, you can basically split your attention accordingly and basically do questions that are aligned to whatever you're trying to achieve or whatever gaps you're trying to bridge, right? Then lastly, we've got the actual toolkit. The toolkit will be based on the case study that you're going to write on. So this one is very often specific to the sitting itself, where you'll have your pre-seen material, you'll have your analysis at the end, and then you'll also have the mock exams, which are based on the same background information as the exam also. So that's basically at the top, but ideally we need to work our way up this pyramid. Is that firstly, we need to be 100% comfortable with the 3 different pillars. Then we basically start to practice it in a case study sort of environment and apply it to different scenarios. Then over and above that, we start to zone in and make it specific to our pre-seen to prepare for the exam, right? And how we basically bring all of these together is what the case study does. And like we said, know your content, practice answering case study tasks and drawing on one pillar, and that's really what our workbook will do. Then doing a real case study analysis, then answering the integrated questions as you'll get them in the exam. So it's very, very progressive. It's like you don't want to take on the entire mountain at once. Take it step by step. it's a lot easier to approach, and you can actually see the progression whereby once you've basically conquered the one level, you can then move on to the other. Right, and like we said, in our enhanced classroom, our online platform, one of the great things about the case study resources you have there is that you also have access to resources that can actually help you with any sort of gaps and transition arrangements. So you'll see there, it basically has a breakdown for each of the subjects in the 3 pillars to make sure that if there are any knowledge gaps, you can actually address them before you get to the case study. And that's a very, very valuable thing, especially because with exemptions, you could be coming from very, very different backgrounds, but everyone is going to be assessed on the same level. So it's quite important that any gaps you have are addressed, and then our enhanced classroom and online platform is a very, very effective way for us to basically do that. And this is very important, of course, for students with exemptions as well. Right. So there you see as well where you've got learning activities in a section specifically for your exemptions, where you could basically start doing some learning activities in order to basically bridge that gap on whichever of those subjects you might not have written an objective test for. Right, basically to sum it up, and I guess this starts to tie in with how we basically go through the preparation and what are some of the key practices that you need to get. Good study habits are very, very important. And this is not just limited to CIMA, not just limited to the case study, but any paper that you basically cover. It's very important that you cover all of the work. And very important that before moving on to anything else, you've actually grasped the concept thoroughly, right? We always encourage asking questions. Another good thing about the case study classes and why we enjoy it so much is to say that sometimes there's something that you might not understand well, and you might get a better understanding of it based on questions that other students have asked as well. So that's why we say it's a good platform for mutual learning. So asking questions and getting that clarity is very, very important. Little and often, I always describe it as learning how to drive. If you were to think of your exam as your driving test or your test to get your license, you've got 7 weeks. You could either every day get into the car, do an hour of driving, and you'll progressively feel yourself getting more comfortable to the extent that it'll almost be on autopilot. You'll be able to do it without even focusing. It's just a muscle memory sort of thing. And that's exactly what we want to do. And you'll see that the program is designed in that way to say everything is split into small chunks, which makes it a lot easier to understand the work gradually and build on that knowledge up until the point where you're ready. If you had your driver's license test, you've got 7 weeks to prepare, and you spend the first 6 weeks doing absolutely nothing, then in that last week you just drive to Durban and back a few times, it won't probably serve you very well in that test. So it's very important that you do little work, or you basically spread your work out over a longer period, but rather build a good routine and the right kind of habits and the right kind of rhythm behind it to make sure that you're working religiously up until such time as you reach the exam. Question practice, very, very important. This is a good way to firstly test your knowledge and see if you understand things well. Also, it's a good way to then identify any knowledge gaps as well. How we always recommend question practice is that when you do the question, do it the first time as a way of testing yourself. After you've done that, do the question again in an open book kind of scenario and see how you'd have answered if you had the book in front of you. Then thirdly, you actually look at the memo, right? Because the memo will give you that specific answer. But if you find that doing the question yourself and doing it as open book, there's still a world of difference. It gives you a clear understanding of the fact that you don't know the work well enough. Go back, study it, grasp it well. Ideally, you want to feel that if you do it open book, it's just a few minor things that you then have that you didn't have off the top of your head, right? So question practice is important. Mock exams very, very important. Like we said, it gives you or it's based on the same background as the exam itself. And there are very, very few resources that will give you that sort of luxury where you can actually practice based on the same pre-scene as the exam itself. So it's important that you use those as part of your preparation and try get the most value out of them. This is really the promise that we're looking at when we actually deliver our classes.